The Battle of the Foothills, Chapter 23 of Shardik by Richard Adams. Gelethlen looked right and left through the falling dusk and rain. His line remained unbroken. For well over an hour the Beckland troops had simply stood their ground, repulsing the fierce but piecemeal attacks of the Ortelgans. At the first onslaught, delivered unhesitatingly and with fanatical courage by no more than 200 or 300 men, he had concluded with relief that he was not opposed by a large force. Then, as more and still more of the Ortelgans emerged from the woods, jostling and pushing their way into a rough-and-ready battle line that spread to right and left until it was as long as his own, he saw that the youth from Gelt had spoken no more than the truth. This was nothing less than an entire tribe in arms, and altogether too numerous for his liking. Soon one attack after another was breaking upon his line, until the slope was covered with dead and crawling, cursing wounded. After some anxious time, however, it became clear that the enemy, who had come upon him as unexpectedly as he had intended, possessed no effective central command, and were merely attacking under individual leaders, group by group, as each baron might decide. He realized that although he was probably outnumbered by something like 3 to 2, this would not in itself bring about his defeat, as long as the enemy lacked all real coordination and discipline. He need do no more than defend and wait. All things considered, these remained the best tactics. His army was at half strength, and that the weaker half. The poor condition of the men, after several days' marching in the heat, had been aggravated by their pummeling in the dust and wind that morning, and the slope below was becoming more muddy and slippery at every moment. As long as the Ortelgans continued to make sporadic attacks here and there along the line, it was an easy matter for the Beckland companies not engaged on either side to turn inwards and help break them up. By nightfall, soon now, his troops might well have had enough, but what it would be best to do then would depend on the state each side was in. His most prudent course might be to return to the plain. It was unlikely that these irregulars would be able to follow them, or that they would even be able, now that the rains had broken, to keep the field. Their food supplies were probably scanty, whereas he had rations, of a sort, for 2 days, and, unlike the enemy, would have the opportunity to commandeer more if he retreated into friendly country. Stand firm until darkness, thought Gelethlen. That's the style. Why risk breaking ranks to attack? And then come away, leaving the rain to finish the job. As he watched the enemy among the trees below, reforming for a fresh attack under the command of a dark, bearded baron with a gold torque on one arm, he thought the idea over and could see nothing wrong with it. And if he could not, presumably his superiors in Bekla would not. He ought not to risk his half-army, either by attacking unnecessarily or by keeping it out in these hills in the rains. His part should be that of a sound, steady commander, nothing flashy. And yet, he paused. When they got back to Bekla, Santilcair Ketlis, that brilliant opportunist, would probably smile understandingly, sympathize with him for having been obliged to come away without destroying the enemy, and then point out how that destruction could and should have been effected. "You a commander-in-chief, Gelethlen?" Santilcair Ketlis had once said, good-humouredly enough, when they were returning together from a drinking party. "Man, you're like an old woman with the housekeeping money. Oh, I wonder whether I might have beaten him down another meld, or perhaps if I'd gone to that other man round the corner. A fine army strikes like the great cats, my lad, swiftly and once. It's like the wheelwright's work. There comes a moment when you have to say, 'Now hit it!' A general who can't see that moment and then sees it doesn't deserve victory." Santilcair Ketlis, victor of a score of engagements, who had virtually dictated his own terms at the conclusion of the slave wars, could afford to be generous and warm-hearted. "And how does one seize the moment?" Gelethlen had asked, rather tipsily, as they each seized something else and stood against the wall. "By never stopping to think of all the things that can go wrong," Santilcair Ketlis had replied. Another attack came up the slope, this time straight towards his centre. The Tenildan contingent, a second-rate lot if ever there was one, were breaking ranks with a kind of nervous anticipation and advancing uncertainly downhill to meet it. Gelethlen ran forward, shouting, "Stand fast! Stand fast, the Tenilda!" At least no one could say that he had a thin word of command. His voice cut through the din like a hammer splitting a flint. The Tenilda fell back and reformed line, the rain pouring off their shoulders. A few moments later the Ortelgan attack came rushing across the last few yards, and struck like a ram against a wall. Weapons rang, and men swayed back and forth, panting and gasping like swimmers and struggling in rough water. There was a scream, and a man stumbled out of the line, clutching his stomach, pitched forward into the mud, and lay jerking, resembling in his unheeded plight a broken fish cast up and dying on the shore. "Stand fast, the Tanilda!" shouted Gellethlin again. A red-headed, raw-boned Ortelgan fellow burst through a gap in the line and ran a few steps uncertainly, looking about him and waving his sword. An officer thrust at him, missed his body as he moved unexpectedly, and wounded him in the forearm. The man spun round yelling and ran back through the gap. Behind the line, Gellethlin, followed by his pennant-bearer, trumpeter, and servant, ran to his left until he was beyond the point of attack. Then, pushing through the front rank of the Dilgai mercenaries, he turned and looked back at the fighting on his right. The din obliterated every noise else, the rain, his own movements, the voices of those about him, and all sounds from the wood below. The Ortelgans, who had evidently now learned, or found a leader with enough sense, to protect the flanks of their assault, had broken through the Tanildan line in a wedge about 60 yards broad. They were fighting, as they had all evening, with a kind of besotted ferocity, prodigal of life. The trampled, muddy ground which they had won was littered with bodies. His own losses, too, were mounting fast. That was only too plain to be seen. He could recognize some of the men lying on the ground, among them the son of one of Capra's tenants, a decent lad, who last winter had acted as his go-between to the girl in Ikat. The attack had become a dangerous one, which would have to be halted and thrown back quickly before the enemy could reinforce it. He turned and made towards the nearest commander in the line, Creetless, that cryptic and reticent soldier, captain of the Dilgai mercenaries. Creetless, though anything but a coward, was always liable to turn awkward, an ally suddenly afflicted with difficulty in understanding plain Becklin, whenever orders did not suit him. He listened as Gellethlin, whom the noise obliged to shout almost in his ear, told him to withdraw his men, bring them across into the centre, and counter-attack the Ortelgans. "Yos, yos!" he shouted back finally. "Bad over there! Better trust us, that's it, eh?" The 3 or 4 black-ringleted young barons standing about him grinned at each other, slapped some of the rain out of their gaudy, bedraggled finery, and went to get their men together. As the Dilgai fell back, Gellethlin found himself unable, in the failing light, to attract the attention of Shaltnakan, the commander adjacent to their left, whom he wanted to close up and fill the gap. He sent his servant across with the order, and as he did so, thought suddenly, Sentilcair Kitlis would have sent the Dilgai out in front of the line to attack the Ortelgans' rear and cut them off. Yes, but suppose they had proved not strong enough for the job, and the Ortelgans had simply cut them to pieces and got out. No, it would have been too much of a risk. Young Shaltnakan and his men were approaching now, their heads bent against the rain driving into their faces. Gellethlin went to meet them, flailing his arms across his chest, for he was wet through to the skin. "Can't we break ranks and attack them, sir?" asked Shaltnakan, before his commander could speak. "My lads are sick of standing on the defensive against that bunch of flea-bitten savages. One good push and they'll break up." "Certainly not," answered Gellethlin. "How do you know what reserves they may have down in those woods? Our men were tired when they got here, and once we break ranks they could be fair game for anything. We've nothing to do but stand fast. We're blocking the only way down to the plain, and once they realize they can't shift us, they'll go to pieces." "Just as you say, sir," answered Shaltnakan. "But it goes against the grain to stand still when we might be driving the bastards over the hills like goats." "Where's the bear?" shouted one of the men. It was evidently a newly invented catchphrase, for 50 voices took it up. "He isn't here." "He's in despair," continued the joker. "He wouldn't dare. We'll comb his hair." "They're still in good spirits, sir, you see," said Shaltnakan. "But all the same, there's 1 or 2 good men have been cut up today by those river frogs, and the boys are going to take it very hard if they're not allowed to have a cut at them before it gets too dark." "And I say stand fast," snapped Gellethlin. "Get back into line, that man," he shouted to the buffoon who was playing the part of the bear. "Dress the front rank. Sword's length between each man and the next." "Stand and bloody shiver," muttered a voice. Gellethlin strode to the rear, feeling his wet clothes clammy against his body. The twilight was deepening, and he was obliged to look about for some moments before he caught sight of Creetless. He ran towards him, and arrived just as the Dilgai went forward into their attack. The concerted rhythmic cry of "Bekla Moat! Bekla Moat!" was taken up along the whole line, but broke off in the centre as the Deilgai closed with the enemy. It was plain that the Ortelgans were ready to pay dearly to hold the gap they had made. 3 times they repulsed the mercenaries, yelling as they stood astride the bodies of their fallen comrades. Many were brandishing swords and shields taken from the dead of decimated Timnilda, and each time an enemy was cut down, the Ortelgan opposing him would stoop quickly to snatch the foreign arms which he believed must be better than his own, though both, as like as not, had been forged from iron of guild. Suddenly a fresh Becklin attack fell upon the Ortelgan right, and again the steady beating cry of "Bekla Moat" rose above the surrounding clamour. Gelflin, who had been about to order Creatlis to attack once more, was peering to his left to make out what had happened, when someone plucked his sleeve. It was Shaltnikan. "Those are my boys attacking them now, sir," he said. "Against orders!" cried Gelflin. "What do you mean by it? Get back!" "They're going to break in a moment, if I know anything about it, sir," said Shaltnikan. "Surely you won't stop us pursuing them now?" "You'll do no such thing," replied Gelflin. "Sir," said Shaltnikan, "if we let them off the field in any sort of order, what's going to be said back in Bekla? We'll never live it down. They've got to be routed, cut to bits, and now's the time to do it, or they'll be off in the dark." The Ortelgans were running back out of the gap as Shaltnikan's attack drove in their right flank. Creatlis and his men followed them, stabbing the enemy's wounded as they advanced. A few minutes later, the original Becklin line was restored. And Gelflin, peering, could make out to his left the gap where Shaltnikan's company had left their place. There could be no denying that it had been a fine stroke of initiative, and no denying either that there was a good deal of force in the argument that the enemy's escape, after the mauling they had suffered, would probably be ill-received in Bekla. To destroy them, on the other hand, would establish his reputation and silence any possible criticism on the part of Santalcair Ketlis. The Becklin officers, obedient to orders, had halted their men on the original defensive line, and the Ortelgans were streaming down the slope unpursued, several supporting their wounded or carrying looted Becklin equipment. As Gelflin watched them, a voice spoke from the ground at his feet. He looked down. It was the tenant lad from Capra's farm near Ikat. He had raised himself on one elbow and was trying to staunch with his cloak a great gash in his neck and shoulder. "Go on, sir, go on," gasped the boy. "Finish them off. I'll take a letter down to Ikat tomorrow, won't I, just like old times? God bless the lady, she'll give me a whole sackful of gold." He pitched forward on his face, and 2 of Shaltnikan's men dragged him back behind the line. Gelflin, his mind made up, turned to the trumpeter. "Well, Wolf," he said, addressing the man by his nickname, "no good you standing there doing nothing. Break ranks, general pursuit, and blow hard so that everyone can hear it." The trumpet had hardly sounded before the various Becklin companies began racing down the slopes, those on the wings scattering widely and trying to turn inwards towards the road. Every man hoped to beat his comrades to the plunder, such as it might be. This was what they had marched through the wind for, withstood the attacks for, shivered obediently for in the rain. True enough, there would be little or nothing to take from these barbarians except their fleas, but a couple of slaves would fetch a good price in Bekla, and there was always the sporting chance of a baron with gold ornaments, or even a woman among the baggage behind. Gelflin ran, too, among the foremost, his pennant-bearer on one side of him and Shaltnikan on the other. As they reached the foot of the slope and came close to the edge of the wood, he could see, among the trees, the Ortelgans once more forming line to meet them. Evidently they meant to go down fighting. For the first time he drew his sword. He might as well strike a blow or two on his own account before the business was done. From close at hand, somewhere inside the wood, there came a loud, grinding, rumbling sound, which grew nearer and changed to a smashing and splintering of wood and a clashing of iron. Immediately after, there sounded above all the tumult a savage roaring, like that of some huge beast in pain. Then the boughs burst apart in front of him, and Gelflin stood rigid with horror, bereft of every feeling but panic fear. The ordinary course of things seen and comprehended, the senses, that 5-fold frame of the world, the unthinking human certainty of what can and cannot reasonably happen, upon which all rational living is based, these dissolved in an instant. If a rag-draped skeleton had come stalking out of the trees on bare, bony feet, invisible to all but himself, and made towards him with wagging head and grinning jaws, He could not have been more stupefied, more deeply plunged into terror and mental chaos. Before him, no more than a few yards away, there stood, more than twice as tall as a man, a beast which could have no place in the mortal world. Most like a bear it looked, but a bear created in hell to torment the inmates by its mere presence. The ears were flattened like a cat's in rage, the eyes glimmered redly in the failing light, and streaked ochreous foam came frothing from between teeth like deal-guy knives. Over one shoulder, and this drove him almost mad with fear, for it proved that this was no earthly creature, it carried a great pointed stake, dripping with blood. Blood, too, covered the claws curving from the one paw raised above its head, as though in some horrible greeting of death. Its eyes, the eyes of a mad creature, inhabiting a world of cruelty and pain, looked down upon Galethlan with a kind of dark intelligence, all too sufficient for its single purpose. Meeting that gaze, he let his sword drop from his hand, and as he did so, the beast struck him with a blow that crushed his skull and drove his head down through his shoulders. A moment later, Shaltnikon fell across his body, his chest broken in like a smashed drum. Creetless, stumbling on the wet slope, made one thrust with his sword before his neck was ripped open in a fountain of blood. And this sword thrust, wounding it, drove the creature to such a frenzy of murderous destruction that every man ran shrieking as it ploughed its way up the crowded slope, seeking whom to tear and destroy. The men on the wings, halted and crying out to learn what had happened, felt their bowels loosen at the news that the bear god, more dreadful than any imagined creature from the nether wastes of fever and nightmare, had indeed appeared, and had recognized and killed of intent the general and 2 commanders. From the wavering Ortelgan line there rose a triumphant shout. Kelderek, limping and staggering with exhaustion, was the first man to emerge from the trees, shouting, "Shardik! Shardik, the power of God!" Then, with yells of "Shardik! Shardik!" which were the last sound in the ears of Takelminion, the Ortelgans poured up the slope, hacking and thrusting anew through the broken Beckland centre. A few minutes afterwards, Kelderek, Baltus, and a score of others reached the mouth of the gorge beyond the ridge, and, heedless of their isolation, faced about to hold it against any who might try to force an escape. Of Shardik, vanished into the falling darkness, there remained neither sight nor sound. Within half an hour, when night put an end to the bloodshed, all Beckland resistance had been quenched. The Ortelgans, following the terrible example which had redeemed them from defeat, showed no mercy, killing their enemies and stripping their bodies of weapons, shields, and armor, until they were as well found a force as ever swept down a Beckland plain. A few of Galethlan's men succeeded in escaping towards Gelt. None found his way past Kelderek to regain the plain by the road up which they had marched that afternoon. With the clouded, rainy moon rose the white smoke of fires coaxed into life by the victors to cook the plundered rations of the enemy. But before midnight the army, urged forward by Zelda and Kelderek so fervently that they stayed not even to bury the dead, were limping on towards Bekla, outstripping all news of their victory and of the total destruction of Galethlan's force. 2 days later, reduced to 2/3 of their strength by fatigue and the privations of their forced march, the Ortelgans, advancing by the paved road across the plain, appeared before the walls of Bekla, smashed in the carved and gilded Tamaric gate, that unique masterpiece created by the craftsman Foothills a century before, after storming it for 4 hours with an improvised ram at the cost of over 500 men, overcame the garrison and the citizens, despite the courageous leadership of the sick Santilcair Kitlas, sacked and occupied the city, and began at once to strengthen the fortifications against the risk of counterattack as soon as the rains should end. Thus, in what must surely have been one of the most extraordinary and unpredictable campaigns ever fought, fell Bekla, the capital of an empire of subject provinces 20,000 square miles in extent. Of those provinces, the furthest from the city seceded and became enemies to its new rulers. The nearer, rather than face the rapine and bloodshed of resistance, put themselves under the protection of the Ortelgans, of their generals, Zelda and Gedladan, and their mysterious priest-king Kelderek, styled Krendrick, the Eye of God.